I'm going to start by asking you the same question I ask all of the guests who come on my show. And that question is, what is your evolution of race consciousness? And for people who haven't heard that phrase before, I'll just summarize it a little bit, let your thoughts percolate. But um, I just am curious to know, just like I am with every guest, when did you first understand there was this thing called race, right? When did you first learn about it? How did your understanding of what it meant change over time in terms of that it meant something about people's skin color, that it was related to how they may or may not be treated, that it was part of a human hierarchy, that it was, related to all kinds of various contexts? And how has your understanding of what race is changed over the course of your life? So, what is, Arturo, your evolution of race consciousness?
Man, for me, it's I would say it's not typical. I grew up in a multiracial family, immigrant family, I should say. And my most of my family's from Cuba, and Cuba's very, very multiracial. It's a mostly black island, and most people don't know that. But I grew up in Union City, New Jersey. Very diverse community. It was a very large Italian community before Latinos started moving in, mostly Cubans. Um, but I grew up maybe a half a block from the projects. So one of the things that really stood out to me as a kid was I noticed how most of the black people in our community lived in the projects, and I couldn't understand that. It wasn't really one of those things that I was really trying to figure out, because there's always these little pockets of Jewish community here with synagogues and everything, and then your Italian neighborhoods and stuff like that. um but like being in a very racially diverse family, obviously, the racial thing is obvious, but it wasn't really an issue till the first time somebody called my mom spick, called one of my cousins the N-word. And I was probably 8 or 9 at the time, and I didn't know what all that meant. And my parents, and grandparents and everybody, being new here, they didn't really understand what racism was like in the US. They had come from Cuba right after Castro desegregated the island. You know, the Civil Rights Act came along 5 years later here in the US. Um, so it was kind of a hard thing to understand, because my parents couldn't really explain how racism works in this country. They knew what racial slurs were. They explained to me, to us as kids, how those are people that are hateful. Um, they think they're superior because they're white, and we had a hard time grasping that, because at the time, New York and that part of New Jersey along the Hudson River, we're all skirting bankruptcy, right? So everybody was struggling. Everybody was poor. Trash service was rare. Like, the whole thing was, we were all living in the same dump essentially. So like the whole superiority complex didn't really register with me. As you get older and you start going to school, you start seeing more of it. Um, and as a teenager, we went across the Hudson River a lot to New York and stuff. And we saw the neo Nazis, and a lot of like hateful stuff like graffiti and things like that. We've seen people get attacked. A gay kid in Washington Square Park, an Asian man in an alleyway, being jumped by multiple skinheads at a time. And honestly, it wasn't till like my whole time growing up into my late teens, I thought that was the extent of racism in the US, right? You have some hateful people. Um, they create hate groups, little neo-Nazi groups, whatever. But when I moved to Texas, one of the first things that happened in 1998 was the lynching of James Byrd. Um, that opened my eyes to a level of racism that we were taught in school didn't exist anymore. Um, his lynching was brutal. I'm reluctant to discuss it. I was friends with a third cousin of his, so like we were getting a lot of details of the story that were pretty harrowing. Both the guys responsible for that lynching ended up getting the death penalty. Both of them have been executed since. Um, But that was one of the brutal things that really rocked my world and opened my eyes to a lot of stuff that I didn't know existed. And then, getting out of high school and stuff and getting into the workplace, you start seeing how systemic racism, starts to unfold. And, I've had bosses that were harder on black employees or, darker Latino employees, darker than me. Um, and you see that and you try to speak up and say something like ease up or, something like that, and it ends up getting you in trouble. And needless to say, my early career in work, I was in a lot of trouble. When I became a government contractor, and I was a FEMA contractor right around the time when FEMA became part of Homeland Security, and we worked the Hurricane Katrina disaster, and the systemic racism really showed its face. It wasn't just the stuff you saw on TV; it was a lot of the stuff on the ground. As disaster contractors, we were like the first ones in. We come in right behind the power company. We did telecommunications work, and we were often told not to hire any locals without any explanation. And I thought, why wouldn't you hire locals? You have a bunch of people that are desperate right now. They're being migrated to different parts of the state and different parts of the country. Like, it didn't make sense to us. So, we found workarounds. I let some of the guys use my address, my mother in law's address, other people's address in Texas to make it look like they were coming from out of state. I had guys that came to work, from all the way as Oregon, New York, Chicago. So a lot of those guys were letting locals use their addresses as well, because we all thought it was really, really screwed up. And there was even an incident with a deaf guy who wanted to come work for us from Chicago, and he had all the stuff to be able to communicate, and they told us no because they felt like they couldn't accommodate him. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that's illegal, but here we are watching them discriminate towards a mostly black population in New Orleans. That the deaf guy thing was just par for the course. We saw a lot of it. We dealt with a lot of it, because I'm Latino. You speak Spanish. Had a lot of Spanish speaking crew. Had a lot of black people that came in from Houston too that I worked with here. That I'm still friends with now, and it was just crazy because in Louisiana, it's a very bipolar state. You could go into the swamps and find somebody, some old, big, burly, Cajun guy who's really cool, racially conscious, like feeds everybody, no problem. But then, you go to the next house and dude's coming out with a shotgun because there's Mexicans and there's black people and there's things like that. So, we had to deal with a lot of that. Um, they tried to keep us out of New Orleans because of all the misinformation about crime and stuff like that. All that turned out to not be true, about all this. That just made it sound like it was just so crazy down there. And like, we were nervous going in there. No doubt about that. But we get there and we had all the Homeland Security paperwork in our dash and magnets on the trucks. They couldn't deny us access. So National Guard had to let us through, and we get in there and it was just the most welcoming. And considering how devastating it was when they found out that we were there to fix the phones, is essentially, how they treated it, and get their communications back up. I mean, everybody embraced us with open arms. Like, they let us sit on their porch. They brought us sweet tea. They brought us, you know, red beans and rice, for breakfast. Like, I mean, we did really well there. As traumatizing as it was, I had a lot of guys that couldn't make it for a month, longer than a month, just because of all the, everything, bodies in houses and all that. But you see, like the way the cops were treating people, and I hate to say it, even the black cops were being pretty shitty towards the civilian population. And that's part of that systemic stuff, right? So, since then I've learned that, once you join a police force, you often hear stuff like, you're no longer black, you're now blue. You're no longer Latino, you're now blue. And that's how a lot of these non-white people buy into the whole white supremacist angle of stuff. So, there was a lot of shootings from the white population towards black people trying to evacuate New Orleans. Like you start seeing all these things. And then as I get older, I start realizing just how big the Afro-Cuban side of my family is. And it turns out it's like 60%, like more than half. And like we are a very, I know it doesn't look like it when you look at me, but we're a very black family. You know, my stepdad's Jamaican. He's been my stepdad for 30 something years. My stepmom's Afro-Colombian. She's been my stepmom since I was 6. I've seen her deal with a lot of racial slurs in Miami. I heard white people tell my dad to speak English. He still doesn't speak English to this day. He's 91. You don't have to really in Miami. It's a pretty large Spanish speaking population. But yeah, there's just so much. And after I had a stroke in 2014 when I was 40, so I got out of the whole government contracting game because I couldn't do it anymore. And I've always been a big on writing. I've always written stuff, poetry, whatever. Um, and I started getting into writing online. Took a lot of journalism courses so I can, make sure my stuff is accurate, make sure I'm meeting the certain standards. Um, and in that process, I saw, systemic racism in journalism and how it's taught and how a lot of the times you hear stuff about pick your narrative, pick a narrative, tell that story. The problem with picking a narrative is you're leaving out a lot of context, right? You're only focused on one part of the story. And in Western journalism, that one part leaves out colonialism, leaves out imperialism, leaves out structural racism, systemic racism. Um, you know, to focus on stuff like mass incarceration, after taking the journalism courses, it's so much easier for me to see these biases. Um, some of them are obvious. When Charlie D'Agata from CBS, after the Ukraine war broke out, talked about how these people look like you and me, talk about Ukrainians, blonde hair, blue eyes. And then he talks about, they're not from some faraway place like the Middle East. And I thought, bro, I mean, I think everybody caught that one. That stuff is very prominent.
Thanks for watching. For access to the full-length conversation and all of the 2-hour-long, unedited conversations that I've had on race, click the support link in the description below. Thanks for your support and see you next time.